Welcome back. You're watching Political Exchange. Of course, we're unpacking the conflict in Syria as well as Egypt and the implications for the Middle East and, of course, also for global relations and diplomacy in general. My guest, Na'eem Jeenah, he's the Executive Director of the AFRO-Middle East Centre. Na'eem, the use of chemical weapons, of course, is the big issue here. Let's assume for a moment that Assad did use those chemical weapons. What ought to be the appropriate action from both the international community and, the region itself? What is it that countries can do to sanction those authorities and institutions that unleash chemical weapons on civilian populations?
First, let me say, Karima, that of course the use of chemical weapons is heinous. It's a weapon of mass destruction, shouldn't be used. But frankly, the idea that chemical weapon use in Syria is a red line after 120,000 people have died in this conflict is a bit odd. So 100,000 mark wasn't a red line, 120 wasn't a red line, but you set off some gas, and that is. So that is an issue. The question should be the capacity of the killing machines here. Of course, the issue of chemical weapon use in Syria, there's also an attendant factor here, and that is that Syria is right next door to Israel. And if you watch the debate in Congress, or the hearing in Congress, Israel came up a number of times. This was also about, they were saying, protecting the interests and security of Israel. And so
which is central to American foreign policy.
Which is central to American foreign policy, particularly in the Middle East region. So, you get tanks and guns going off, and, 500,000 people die. It's not such a big thing. But chemical weapons could
so the subtext, of course, is the interests of Israel.
Absolutely, absolutely. Now, your question about what can be done by the region, I think that at this point in time, there's very little that can be done. These strikes, if they do take place, is not going to make it's not going to be that great of a deterrent against the Assad regime. Secondly, that frankly the regime doesn't need to use chemical weapons against the rebel groups. They overpower them in terms of weapons and types of weapons, amount of weapons, etc. In many places, they now over the past couple of months have been winning the battle. They don't need to use chemical weapons. So even if it does serve as a deterrent, it's not going to make a difference to the balance of forces on the ground.
It's interesting that you say that they've been winning. Is the possibility of Assad reinstating his grip on power and potentially pushing the rebels back what could be part of why the strike is being initiated?
No, I don't believe that. I believe that we've gone beyond that point. There's no possibility of a military victory in the Syrian conflict. The only
political solution.
Is a political solution.
And
neither the rebels nor the regime is going to win.
How do you initiate a political solution where both sides are not strong enough to defeat each other, emphatically? You need leadership on both sides. But of course, there's also the intervention from the rest of the global community, egging the various interest groups on to be quite emphatic and to be almost triumphalist. What is it that's going to be the silver bullet? And in fact, is there a silver bullet to bring the parties together to initiate the beginnings of a political, solution?
Well, of course, as you know, there have been lots of attempts. Kofi Annan, Lakhdar Brahimi, and then the Geneva Conference, and now the talk of the Geneva II. At different points in time, the reason that different parties didn't want to come to the table was because of where they stood in terms of the balance of forces.
So they wanted to win on the ground and demonstrate that in negotiation.
And for a long time, until just very recently, both sides thought that they could win it militarily, both delusionally in my opinion, but they both thought they could win it militarily and therefore didn't want to go to the table. In the last month or two, last 3 months, the push for this Geneva II conference, with the Americans and the Russians agreeing that this is where things should end up around the table at Geneva II, it was actually the opposition that didn't want to go to the table, and that was because at this point they felt that they were too weak to be able to negotiate.
So they were going to have to concede too much.
Exactly. So the point and the one possibly positive thing, I say that biting my tongue, out of these potential strikes, whether they happen or not, is that the Americans would use that as leverage over the opposition to say, okay, you wanted us to play a role, we did it.
Go to the table.
Now you have to reciprocate and go to the table. And so we could see, as a result, Geneva 2 happening in the next couple of months. That's my optimistic outlook.
Okay, let's shift gear a little bit, Na'eem, and go to the situation in Egypt. We've seen a complete, outright attack on the Muslim Brotherhood, both militarily but also from the courts. Strings of people appearing in court on various charges, people being attacked in prison after they've been sentenced. The military re-establishing itself very, very firmly. The world, of course, very quiet about the killing of close to 1,000 Muslim Brotherhood members. What are the implications of this kind of clampdown on the Muslim Brotherhood's strategy going forward? They've historically been quite or committed to a peaceful solution. Are there elements in the Muslim Brotherhood who would now be arguing for a more violent approach to participating in, the political struggle in Egypt?
Yeah. Well, firstly, of course, that the repression is not just against the Muslim Brotherhood. It's against a number of Islamist forces and now a number of others. So you're getting trade unionists who are not even believers being called Islamists so that they can get arrested.
But we all knew, of course, that this was eventually what was going to happen.
Exactly. But your question about where does the Muslim Brotherhood go, I think that clearly where it's going to go now is underground.
And it knows that terrain very well.
It knows that terrain very well. I mean, already now in the past few weeks, they've been operating, in the pre-electronic communication days, as they did. And so they're going to go underground. I don't think that the Brotherhood itself is going to resort to arms. It's just not part of its new ideology from the 50s. Even after the repression of 1954, it didn't take that route. But what you did see was small groups that split away, that felt that this kind of quote-unquote moderate line is not acceptable in the face of such dictatorship, and we need an armed response. And so the Islamic fighting group and others. Okay, so you could get one or two of those splitaways, or some people leaving the Brotherhood and joining groups that might be waiting on the wings, that might want to take that action. But the bigger message, not only in Egypt and across the region, and just following the discourse now, the bigger message that many people are saying is coming out is that you can't be Islamist and participate democratically. So it was Algeria, it was Hamas in the Palestinian Authority, it's the Brotherhood here. There's issues in Tunisia, although I think they're resolving those issues. And so that's once that message takes hold, and we're not there yet, it hasn't taken hold, but once that message takes hold, then it's the discourse of Al-Qaeda and Ayman al-Zawahiri that become predominant, because their discourse is democracy is not good for Muslims.
And they can point to a lot of instances where Islamist forces are cheated out of the democratic victory.
No, they're already saying it. You guys are idiots, you should have listened to us. We told you this won't work. Any democratic process doesn't give Islamists a fair opportunity. Now you're suffering for it, and ours is the only way to do it. And that discourse can then attract particularly younger, more radical people to say, this is correct.
Now, of course, we know that when the so-called Arab Spring started mushrooming in many, many countries, there was a great welcome from many quarters in the world for various reasons, of course, and very different reasons, about the, democratization of very repressive societies, that people were beginning to take their destinies into their own hands. And of course we see those Arab Springs having turned into long winters of discontent, but it has very interesting implications for the democratization project. And we've seen in Egypt, for example, the fatal tactical and strategic mistakes being made by leftist groupings opposed to the Muslim Brotherhood's approach to politics post-election. And of course, now that the military is in power, once the Brotherhood is dealt with, the question is who's next? And we've already seen that some of the leaders are being arrested. What does this tell us, Na'eem, about how democracy is evolving, particularly in the Middle East, in many societies where there's quite repressive governments, but there's also quite courageous action from citizens to try and be in control of their own destinies?
I think the one mistake that we all made, and I say we all because all of us globally are part of that, is the kind of too uncritical, not completely, but too uncritical euphoria in 2011. Tunisia, Egypt, and then Libya, okay, was a problem, but Yemen, and we got all excited. Democratization doesn't take place in 2 weeks. These are long processes. They're long, hard processes. And when they suddenly happen, then you should be suspicious that something is wrong. We didn't see a revolution in Tunisia or in Egypt. Libya is a different case. We had a bit of a civil war and I think a revolution, for better or worse. But certainly we didn't see a revolution in Egypt. To tout it as a revolution and then forget that there's actually the old order waiting in the background to cut you down to size and take over again.
And rooted in institutions of state.
Absolutely.
The military, the judiciary.
The term deep state applies very well to Egypt and to Syria for that matter.
And we've discussed this theory of deep state, of course, and we know that, governments come and go, but the state, in many instances, and the institutions through which people really wield power remain, and often remain intact, despite what we see on the streets and so on. Just in terms of the way in which the United States and, of course, the rest of the globe interact with developments. We know when the Arab Spring broke out, the US was kind of caught off guard. They didn't know what was going on, and some argued that they had very little to do with it. But, of course, they were then able to plug in. Where to from here? If you were to advise Barack Obama, what would the advice be that you give him?
God, I'm glad I'm not. No, I think that the United States firstly should pull out of their interventions in the Middle East. Secondly, listen to what people actually have to say. People on the ground, not the armies, not the
people on the ground say different things.
Yes, and you have to listen to all the different things. In that diversity is where the truth lies. In the midst of that diversity, so listen to all of that. And then if you do want to put your money somewhere, and your mouth for that matter, it should be in supporting true and genuine democratization. People having a voice, doing things for themselves, but in a transparent way. And this is part of the problem with the US political intervention in these places, that it's not transparent. And so clearly they support with agendas, etc., and people get upset about that. But in a transparent way, support democracy emerging, and whatever the results of that democracy are, to accept and protect or defend those results. That's not what we're seeing. That's not what we've seen in the past.
Of course, a lot of people involved in diplomatic initiatives and the way in which states actually work will say, Na'eem, that's pie in the sky. This is realpolitik. This is about interests. And if you take these interests into account, you will find that it's very hard for people to back processes that are about ordinary people taking control of themselves. This is about vested interests, both in terms of oil, political influence, geopolitical issues.
Yes, and unfortunately, many states, most states perhaps, operate in that kind of way. Certainly the United States has taken that to a fine art. I think that they're finding now in the past couple of years and in the next few years that approach is going to bite them in the backside. Saudi Arabia is no longer as buddy-buddy with the US as it used to be after the US dumped Mubarak. The Egyptian military basically said to the Americans, take your aid and take a hike. Because Saudi will fill in the gap, they've said.
So money is not enough anymore.
Money is not enough anymore. In Libya, I mean, the French went in there and they signed deals before Gaddafi fell. Before he was killed, they signed deals about control over the resources, etc. After the new government was formed, they said, sorry, we're going to have to renegotiate everything. And so these countries are realizing that operating in foreign countries on the basis of your national interest, irrespective of who you're dealing with, can become a big problem. And I think that it's going to bite them in the next few years. And hopefully that'll mean that they will scale down their intervention and be more willing to listen to people who are genuine democrats rather than listen to people who just wants to sing their tune. Iraq is another example. Remember that they supported that guy Shalabi, who gave them all the wrong information about Iraq simply because he wanted to get into power.
Well, that's where we will have to leave it. Of course, these conflicts will rage on, and we will, of course, return to them from time to time. Na'eem, thank you so much for joining us. That's where we will have to leave it for this edition of Political Exchange. Join me again on Monday night for another edition of the program. I'm Karima Brown. Goodbye.